Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. This last week, the Secretary General of NATO said, "We now have war in Europe on a scale and a type we thought belonged to history." Putin's invasion of the Ukraine is a surprise for many, especially those with a humanistic, social, Darwinistic worldview. These people thought that evil national aggression belonged to the old world, but now modern 21st century man is beyond that. We can live in negotiation and great peace. Well, that's what the world thought before World War II broke out. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. In the 1930s, Germany was considered the most sophisticated and scientifically advanced nation on earth, and yet out of that intelligentsia came great evil. Communism, Nazism, Japanese imperialism, all came out of empowered, godless people. The nations of the world in the 21st century, in abandoning Christianity for secularism, are going on the same path. We have not become more enlightened, we've become more dark. And the Christian moral foundation for freedom and human rights and peace and prosperity have been removed. So things will get worse. Remember, a liberal is someone who thinks he can remove the roots and still have the flower. Psalm chapter 11, verse 3, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? So Western nations are promoting government largesse, deficit spending their way to prosperity, devaluing the currency. Western nations are promoting sexual deviance, homosexuality, transgenderism, pornography, immorality, abortion to get rid of the responsibility of children. People are saying we don't need police, we don't need jails, we don't need the morals of the past, we can legalize drugs, we don't need borders. We can have equality regardless of responsibility and merit. And the leftist intellectuals in the universities and in politics make it their goal to deconstruct all the values of the past. And the church? Who goes to church? Sunday's a day for sports. But then reality comes knocking at the door. What you sow, you reap. He who sows from the flesh shall from the flesh reap corruption. Families begin to break up. Young people become delinquents, couch potatoes, drug addicts. The economy collapses. There's an end to innovation and motivation. Few people want to work hard. Manufacturing is outsourced. People pursue hedonism. It doesn't take much for leftism to destroy a nation. And when it happens, evil demagogues arise and take advantage of an immoral, unprincipled people at home and on the battlefields abroad. And the whole thing reminds us of the poem by Kipling, The Gods of the Copybook Heading. The copybook headings were those moral aphorisms that used to be printed on the top of children's work pages. And the children used to practice their penmanship by writing 20 times statements such as, "What you sow, you shall reap. Your sin will find you out. A penny saved is a penny earned." And Kipling was calling these truths the gods, or the rules of life, on the tops of the pages. And Kipling's poem is all about how liberals scoffed and abandoned those values. Women left their children. Men abandoned their faith and reason. People gave up their weapons and replaced work with socialism. But in the end, the principles taught in the copybook headings are immutable. So Kipling ends the poem, "As it will be in the future, it was at the birth of man. There are only 4 things certain since social progress began: that the dog returns to his vomit and the sow returns to her mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. And that after this is accomplished and the brave new world begins, when all men are paid for existing and no man must pay for his sins, As surely as water will wet us, as surely as fire will burn, the gods of the copybook headings with terror and slaughter return. And again, as the Secretary General of NATO said, we now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged only to history. And this truth is first given to us in the biblical history of Israel. The phrase is repeated continually. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord raised up adversaries. After God delivered the nation, 40 or 50 years would pass, and the Israelites thought that they were safe. They no longer needed to be serious about God and His truth. They could allow for other ideologies and other gods, and there arose a younger generation that had no interest in Jehovah. Then the truths of the copybook headings, the laws of God with terror and slaughter returned. So who would have thought that after the Soviet Union was dissolved under Mikhail Gorbachev and his policies of glasnost and perestroika, that 40 years later, Russia would be going to war to get it all back? Nobody suspected that. A couple of weeks ago, I quoted a pastor in America who said he was 99% sure Putin would not invade Ukraine. Then I quoted a State Department official who said he didn't think Putin would invade Ukraine. And this week, a listener sent me a letter from a native missionary in Ukraine, letter from Vitaly and Alexandria Keller in Ukraine. Dear brothers and sisters, how wrong I was when I wrote you last time that Putin would not dare to do evil and attack Ukraine in front of the entire civilized world. He did it, and we see heartbreaking photos and videos of destroyed homes, hospitals, and kindergartens, of people hiding in basements for many days in a row without water, heat, and food. Putin is destroying our country in a brazen way right before the eyes of the whole world, and the whole world is afraid to intervene for fear of starting World War III. But the war is already underway, and fortunately, the world is ready to sacrifice Ukraine for the sake of peace in their own countries. But will Putin stop there? So even the Ukrainians were surprised by Russia's violent aggression. Last week, I watched two foreign documentaries. One called the Auschwitz Report, recounting how two prisoners escaped to tell the world what was happening. Another called The Invisibles, about the 1,700 Jews who lived undercover in Berlin throughout the war. In both documentaries, the point is made that nobody believed the evil that was being done by the Nazis, by Hitler. When those two prisoners came out with their Auschwitz report, published by the Red Cross, the West didn't believe it. And even the Jews who stayed behind in Berlin did not know or believe what was happening to their relatives in the prison camps. They just thought that they were working in war factories. I mean, they knew the Germans didn't like them, but they didn't think the Germans would kill them. And those Jews who went into hiding simply refused to board those trains because they didn't want to work for the Nazis. So the people at that time were too trusting in government. They didn't believe in man's potential for evil. The governments at that time also believed in Hitler's lies. And so there was the 1939 German-Soviet non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler broke that agreement and invaded Russia. There was also the 1938 Munich Agreement between Hitler, France, Italy, and the UK, which allowed for Germany to invade Czechoslovakia, and the West would permit that invasion in exchange for Germany being at peace with everyone else. Well, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement. And by the way, the Munich Agreement violated previous agreements European countries had with Czechoslovakia. So it was called the Munich Betrayal. History has repeated itself. back in 1994, when Ukraine broke off from the Soviet Union, Ukraine agreed to give up the nuclear weapons it had retained from the old Soviet Union in exchange for the United States protecting Ukraine from foreign invasion, and with the promise that Russia would not invade. This was called the Budapest Memorandum. So now Russia invades Ukraine, and Ukraine is not being defended by the United States and NATO. So we lied, and Russia lied. And the Ukrainians now wish they never gave up their nuclear weapons. At the time, Ukraine was having second thoughts about the Budapest Agreement, and President Clinton stepped in and said, unless the Ukrainians signed the agreement, they would not get U.S. support. So the Ukrainian government was pressured to sign. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, the Ukrainians asked, what about the Budapest Agreement? The United States under Obama, not wanting to go to war with Russia over Crimea, reneged on the Budapest Agreement in 2014, and now Biden is reneging on it in 2022. Just like France, Italy, and the UK reneged on their agreement to protect Czechoslovakia from Germany. The Munich Agreement and now the Budapest Memorandum are historic examples of the foolishness of appeasing totalitarian states. Proverbs 22:3. The prudent sees evil and hides himself, but the naive go on and are punished for it. What makes for a prudent man? That is, what makes for the one who sees evil as opposed to the one who is naive concerning the potential for evil? Well, prudence comes from the Word of God, thinking biblically. And practically, the Scriptures give us a true understanding of the depravity that resides in the human heart. And that's something fallen mankind doesn't understand apart from God's revelation, because we tend to overestimate our own goodness. Therefore, the person with a Christian worldview, with Christian beliefs, is much more suspicious, much less trusting. When communist nations make promises, we're not so trusting. As Reagan said, trust but verify. When governments require people to get on trains and go to work camps, we run for the hills because we know the human potential for evil. We run from governments that violate human rights. They can't be trusted. But if you have a secular worldview that everyone is basically good, you'll be naive and you'll go on and you'll be punished for it. One of the main differences between liberalism and conservatism is this belief in human depravity and sin. So today's program is again about this theme, that how when evil arises in the world, people are unsuspecting and they're surprised. Again, it's 1 Thessalonians 5:3, when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them. Or Isaiah chapter 47, verse 11. But evil will come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away, and disaster will fall upon you for which you cannot atone, and destruction about which you do not know will come upon you suddenly. There's always a surprise on the part of the ungodly, on the part of the unspiritual, when evil and disaster comes. And this surprise is not an academic deficiency. It's a moral deficiency. It's a failure to see evil in oneself and hence not see it in others. It's a failure to believe what God has said about sin and coming judgment. Just like in 586 BC, the Israelites did not believe that the Babylonians would destroy Israel because they thought that they were too good to suffer such a fate. So I'm titling today's program, World War III, More Likely Than Not. Not that I'm making a prophecy about what will happen, but there are certain elements in this conflict, certain situations in the world, a confluence of events that foreshadow an escalation to this war. Last week, Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, said in an NBC interview, World War III may have already started. Quote, "Nobody knows whether it may have already started. And what is the possibility of this war if Ukraine falls? It's very hard to say. We've seen this 80 years ago. When the Second World War had started, nobody then would have been able to predict when the full-scale war would start." So let's look at this situation. Putin invades Ukraine. He is surprised that the West has reacted so aggressively against his invasion with economic sanctions and supplying the Ukrainian army with military supplies. I mean, after all, the West allowed him to invade Ukraine and Georgia without putting up any opposition. But even still, NATO is afraid to escalate the situation by sending in troops. And the Europeans are not cutting off purchases of Russian oil. So this is to Putin's advantage. The nation that will not fight out of fear of war gives the aggressor the advantage. If Biden had told Putin before Putin invaded Ukraine that the U.S. would send in troops to defend Ukraine, that threat probably would have caused Putin to return to his previous strategy. That is, trying to slowly annex Ukraine by undermining the Ukrainian government. But Biden was telling Putin what the United States would not do rather than telling Putin what the United States would do. And I believe this headline is right on here from Fox News. Biden playing our very strong hand in a very weak way. Quote, Rebecca Koffler, who is a former DIA intelligence officer and author of Putin's playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America, told Fox News Digital that the Russians understand the conflict in Ukraine as a proxy war between Russia and the United States. We are on a geopolitical collision course with Russia. Our national interests are irreconcilable, the way that both countries define them. She warns that President Biden is playing our very strong hand in a very weak way by squandering the power of the United States to deter Russian invasion. So, it's like Biden has a royal flush and Putin only has a straight. And Biden is holding back his chips because he's afraid of losing. To deter war, NATO has to be able to risk war. Otherwise, it cannot deter war. Last week, my program was about Biden's foolish energy policy. And I played plenty of clips showing this, but I came across a few more. And Americans for Tax Reform put them into a montage. I just have to play this for you.
No new fracking. We are going to get rid of fossil fuels.
Well, like what about, say, stopping fracking and stopping new pipe?
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel, and I am not going to cooperate with you, okay? No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends. Number one.
3 consecutive American presidents have enjoyed stints of explosive economic growth due to a boom in oil and natural gas production. As president, would you be willing to sacrifice some of that growth, even knowing potentially that it could displace thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in the interest of transitioning to that greener economy?
The answer is yes.
Unbelievable, isn't it? Biden is saying, I guarantee you we are going to end fossil fuels. And he's saying no ability for the oil industries to continue to drill. This is leftist, earth-worshipping nonsense. These people are Stalin's useful idiots. But this is God's plan. It's the way it has to be. If Trump was elected, there'd probably be a different domestic policy toward fossil fuels, and we'd have low gas prices, and there would be a different foreign policy, so Russia probably would not have invaded Ukraine. But it may be time for God to judge the nations with foolish leaders, even with someone like Putin. Isaiah chapter 3, verse 4, and I will make mere lads their princes, and capricious children will rule over them, and the people will be oppressed. Well, because of Israel's sin, the curse upon the nation was foolish leaders. But let's not forget what happens to these foolish leaders. Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 1, woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture. Or Isaiah chapter 33, verse 1, as soon as you are finished destroying, you will be destroyed. As soon as you cease to deal treacherously, others will deal treacherously with you. God raised up foolish kings, and God raised up the Assyrian Empire to destroy, but then they would be destroyed. So, how do we know that the invasion of Ukraine was the will of God? Well, because it happened. And that's the paradox. So theologians like to divide between the permissive will of God and the perfect will of God, but that's a whole other subject. What we have in the plan of God right now is that Joe Biden is president and Putin is over Russia. Let's get back to the situation. Now that Putin has invaded, NATO has lost the power of the threat. To stop Putin, the United States and NATO are really going to have to go to war with Russia. But again, NATO and the United States are afraid of starting World War III, just like in 1939, the Allies were afraid of starting World War II. But on the other hand, the United States knows that it must do something. Because if we don't push back, that will embolden Putin to take over other Eastern European countries. So we're supplying money and military arms to the Ukraine. We're, in effect, fighting a proxy war against Russia in the Ukraine. And Russia knows this. They know they're actually fighting NATO and the United States. And Putin is probably happy that the United States is fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Remember, we did the same thing in Vietnam. A proxy war between Russia and the United States in Vietnam. And Nixon did not fight this war full on because he was afraid of escalating a war with Russia. That was Nixon's folly, and we're doing it again. So in the providence of God, Biden is between a rock and a hard place. If he helps the Ukrainians, the war will escalate. If he doesn't help the Ukrainians, the war will escalate. So he's trying to play some middle ground, which often results in what one is trying to avoid in the first place. Now, Europe is very frightened, especially Poland and the Balkan states. We can understand why. They know what it was like to be invaded by Russia and to be under the Soviet Union for 50 years. They remember how Stalin stole the Ukrainian harvest and starved to death 4 million Ukrainians. They remember the poverty of being under the Soviet Union. Poland would love to send in troops to help the Ukrainians, but they're waiting on the United States to lead. And the United States might be making a big mistake by dragging his feet. Now back home in the United States, Biden is putting his finger to the political wind. At first, he refused to ban Russian oil imports, but then members of his own party began to put pressure upon him, and he banned the imports. And this is really out of character for the Democrat Party. For some reason, the Democrats are being very hawkish, wanting the United States to get more involved. The political right generally wants to be involved, but even the left wants Biden to allow Poland to give those MiG fighters to the Ukraine. They want the U.S. to put up a no-fly zone, and the left is just pressuring Biden to do more. And this is the providence of God, so that maybe we do end up in World War III. There was a segment on ABC's The View where these women, all on the left, blamed the Republicans for not wanting to help Ukraine more. And that was odd. Quote, for days, President Biden has refused to approve or facilitate the transfer of MiG-29 fighter jets from Poland to Ukraine because of the asinine argument that they're offensive weapons and not defensive ones. But according to ABC's The View, this was all the fault of congressional Republicans and somehow former President Trump. So I found that to be an interesting example of how even the left wants more U.S. involvement. Not that we shouldn't get more involved, but even the left is pushing for it. Here's a piece from the Wall Street Journal. The administration refused to impose sanctions in the lead up to Mr. Putin's invasion, naively trusting diplomacy. Even after Russian tanks rolled, and despite having months to prepare, the U.S. response has been slow, timid, hostage to feel-good multilateralism, and unwilling to attack the real engine of the Russian economy, energy. Even the president's own party is losing patience with his inadequate sanctions. But again, Biden fears, and this is what his advisors are telling him, that if the U.S. pushes Putin too hard, then Putin will get desperate, escalate the war, and may use some sort of nuclear device. And this too is also in the providence of God. Maybe Biden's fear is a Leviticus 26 situation. And the sound of a driven leaf will chase them. And even when no one is pursuing, they will flee, as though from the sword they will fall. Here's a fact, a terrible fact that everyone agrees on. Putin cannot afford to lose this war. He will not lose face. There's no off-ramp for Putin. He will use nuclear weapons before he surrenders Ukraine. And he has nothing to lose at this point. He will put all of his chips on the table, even if he has a terrible hand. And the mistake is to think he's going to act logically. I mean, that's the mistake everybody made about the Third Reich. Why would Hitler attack both the East and the West? He knows he can't handle a war on two fronts, but Hitler did it anyway because evil is never rational. And this is the Russian strategy. If they begin to lose, they will escalate the war in order to de-escalate it. And Putin is the kind of totalitarian dictator who would risk the possibility of a nuclear war with NATO if it gives him the chance to rebuild the Soviet Union. Plus, probably, Putin believes that in a nuclear war scenario, the West would hold back while Russia would fire everything. For Putin, he may not win, but neither will his enemy. He probably doesn't fear mutually assured destruction. There's a reason why last week Putin launched a hypersonic missile. Putin was sending a message to the West that he will not lose this war, that he's willing to escalate. And notice the war that Putin is fighting. He's not sending his troops into the Ukrainian cities to fight an insurgency, a guerrilla warfare. He's remaining outside the cities and bombing civilian hospitals and apartments. You know, he can comfortably do this for months and level every city. When the United States fights, we want to avoid civilian casualties. But the Russian method for winning is to demoralize the population and destroy everything and everyone. The Russians don't have the same moral compunctions as the West. And this changes the whole dynamic of the situation. Also, Syria is now planning to send in 20,000 to 40,000 troops to help Putin in Ukraine. Belarus is also sending in troops to help Putin. China is now considering giving financial and military aid to Russia. China has spoken out against the West, putting economic sanctions upon Russia because they don't want the West to place economic sanctions on them when they invade Taiwan. And this week, the Saudis made an oil deal with China, trading in Chinese currency rather than in the US dollar. And that's what China, Russia, and Iran want, to get rid of the US dollar as being the world monetary standard, especially now that the United States has devaluated the dollar through money printing and deficit spending. We're doing this to ourselves. If war gets hot in Eastern Europe, China will likely move to take over Taiwan. If the US and NATO aren't going to militarily get involved in protecting Ukraine, they certainly won't come to the aid of Taiwan. I mean, Ukraine has 44 million people and Taiwan only has 23 million. If we won't do anything because we're afraid of a war with Russia, we certainly won't do anything because we'll be afraid of a war with China. I mean, what? Is the U.S. going to engage in a naval battle with China when we won't even do a no-fly zone over Ukraine? So imagine if China invades Taiwan and the U.S. enacts a trade embargo on China, every major U.S. company has a manufacturing facility in China. China knows it can destroy the American economy in the short term if we cut off trade with them. And if China attacks Taiwan, Japan would also help the U.S. defend Taiwan because Japan doesn't want to see China expand. And seeing all this, it would be time for North Korea to make a move on South Korea because the U.S. couldn't easily defend three fronts. This would also be a signal for the Muslim world to attack Israel. I mean, why not? All hell has broken out in the world. What's there to lose? So the scenario that everyone is talking about is Western nations, Europe and the U.S. versus Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. It would be a war between those nations who believe in the totalitarian model for government, that the best state of affairs is to have overlords and subjects, versus those countries who believe in democratic human rights and freedoms, that model for government. And this conflict has been brewing for 100 years, and it could explode overnight. Or, God could shut the whole thing down with one word. I mean, there's this perfect storm of confluence. It looks like everything that causes wars, or has caused wars in the past, is now coming together. But God could hold it all back until the iniquity of the world grows greater. Psalm 46:8, "Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolation in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire." In Hebrew parallelism, there is actually a contrast between verses 8 and 9. In verse 8, it's actually teaching that God allows there to be war. He brings forth desolation in the earth. On the other hand, verse 9, we read that God is the one who also stops or prevents wars. And the point is that if God didn't make wars to cease, wars would never end and mankind wouldn't have survived this long. So, in our current situation, God's Spirit could restrain the thoughts and the intents of these world leaders, or God could let the demons, the unclean spirits, go out to the kings of the earth to gather them together for war. Revelation 16:3. We don't know yet. But given the moral condition of this world, we know we're on borrowed time. We know that we're in the last hour of God's prophetic clock. It's not if the day of the Lord will come, it's just when. So how do we discern? Not that the church needs to predict the specifics of the future, the exact day and hour, but the Holy Spirit does give his people warning. I recently received a newsletter from a listener, and the author, one of these religious prophetic pundits, said that Mr. Trump will come back into office and, quote, God has prophesied that he will save America one last time. But how do we discern such things? Is this really what the Spirit of God is saying? So here's a Bible study. When the Assyrians invaded Israel in about 700 BC, Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army. The prophet Isaiah told Hezekiah that Israel would be miraculously delivered. 2 Kings 19. Therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to the city or shoot an arrow here, and he will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return. And he shall not come to the city, declares the Lord. But in 586 BC, 120 years later, when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Babylonian army, the prophet Jeremiah said to the king of Israel, surrender, you're going to lose. Jeremiah chapter 21, verse 4, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, behold, I'm about to turn back the weapons of war which are in your hand, in which you are warring against the king of Babylon and the Chaldeans, who are besieging you outside the wall, and I will gather them into the center of this city. I myself will war against you with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, even in anger and wrath and great indignation. So here's the irony. Under Hezekiah, the false prophets were saying Israel was going to lose and needs to surrender, but the true prophets were saying Israel is going to win. Under Zedekiah, the false prophets were saying Israel is going to win, and the true prophets were saying Israel is going to lose. So if you were living in those days, who do you believe? Does faith always mean having faith in national victory? That's the way it's often taught. Well, the way you'd be able to tell is by having your finger on the moral pulse of the nation. The false prophets were promising peace to a people who, because of their sin, were ripe for judgment. The true people of God, who were sensitive to the law of God, naturally gravitated over to Jeremiah's side. I mean, seeing the evil in the nation and understanding the holiness of God, the true followers of God understood that Israel was not getting a second chance. The only way to stop the evil was for judgment to come. And I believe that's how Christians today know how to direct their faith in regard to what will happen in America. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 14, mature believers who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. The news this week about Disney going full LGBTQ against DeSantis' legislation in Florida, prohibiting the teaching of transgenderism in K through 3rd, is a bad sign. The CEO of Disney tried not to get involved, but the Disney employees protested, wanting Disney to support the teaching of transgenderism to young children, because this is the godless immorality that these millennial employees learned in public school. That gender can be fluid, that there is no God who makes a distinction between male and female, that homosexuality is perfectly fine. And the Bible and Christian truth has been banned from public schools, and now we're seeing the results. GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, is being consulted and has been consulted on all Disney movies and scripts. So Disney is full LGBTQ. Twitter is banning anyone who uses male pronouns to refer to the swimmer, Leah Thompson. Read the book of Jude and see what God has to say about gross immorality and the judgment to come. In such times of immorality, it's not time for the church to be saying America is going to be saved from war or that we're going to have a second chance. There is a line that a nation can cross when God says enough, when it's time to purge the nation with the spirit of judgment, with the spirit of burning. Isaiah 4:4. Revelation chapter 6. The first horseman of the apocalypse goes forth. Chapter 6, verse 2, I looked and behold a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And by the fourth horseman, a fourth of the earth is killed by sword, famine, and disease. And the going forth of the horsemen begin the events of the apocalypse, the rise of the Antichrist, the one world government, the Great Tribulation. So here's another Bible study. Does the war described in Revelation chapter 6, the coming forth of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, does this happen before or after the Antichrist is revealed? Many last-time teachers assume that the four horsemen of the apocalypse come after the Antichrist is revealed or in conjunction with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But the text doesn't say that. It just says someone goes forth conquering and to conquer, and peace is taken from the earth. And this war could come before the Antichrist and be the occasion for the world embracing globalism and embracing a president of the world. And have you noticed all of the intellectuals, both academic and political, are ready for globalism? That attitude was not widespread after World War II, but will be after World War III. Notice this piece. Wisconsin County Supervisor wants Pledge of Allegiance gone, says it's not inclusive. The pledge is not suitable to the current pluralistic society, supervisor says. Do you think a school supervisor would have said that back in the 1940s? I can hear the hoofbeats of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And the world is readying itself for the great Antichrist delusion. Revelation chapter 14, verse 15, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. So in closing, my description here of current events is not meant for the purpose of encouraging Christians to start prepping or building safe houses, but to be spiritually prepared. Mark chapter 13, take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It's like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigned to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether at evening or midnight, or when the rooster crows or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert. And the point is to not be caught up in all the things of this world so that we fail to serve Christ and we fail to fulfill the Great Commission. Now more than ever, we need to double down on evangelism, church attendance, holy living, prayer. All the things that are happening in the world are a reminder of why we're here. And when we see these things begin to take place, we're to lift up our eyes for our redemption draws near. Thanks for listening. Next week, I'll continue in this. Maybe we'll look into some conspiracy theories about Ukraine. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, to share, to leave a comment below. And may Jesus Christ reign.